Okay. Uh, Welcome to um, day one, I suppose. This is a brief lecture on book one of Plato's Republic. And this is for the use of my political science 1030 class for summer term here at Clemson University. Um, so, I'm just going to dive right in. And as will be the case with all of the lectures, I just want to emphasize as thoroughly as I can that if you have any questions, if you have any concerns, if anything makes sense or doesn't make sense, or if there's anything you want to comment on, or if there's anything you want me to clarify, or if there's anything at all about the lecture that brings to mind questions or concerns, just email me and I'll get back to you as quickly as I can. Um, One of the, you know, bugs associated with the sort of online format is that I can't see your faces and I can't see you, and so I don't know if something isn't making sense. I don't know if if you're not paying attention or what you're doing, or if you have a quizzical look on your face. And so, deprived of those signals, I have to just sort of soldier on and push through the material. So, if something comes along that you uh, uh, aren't crazy about, just shoot me an email and we can discuss. All right, so Plato's Republic. Just to be clear, just a couple of bookkeeping things here. So we are reading Alan Bloom's translation of Plato's Republic. So this PDF that I've uploaded is a PDF copy of a translation of the work done by a guy named Alan Bloom, who was a Straussian political philosopher of the 20th century. This book is now in its third edition, I think, and it is the basis of the PDF that I've shared with you here. So just to be clear, there are basically three things that have to be distinguished. On the one hand, there's Bloom. Bloom translated the work, and he also provides uh, a really great textual apparatus, by which I mean he provides an introduction, which can be found here. It's relatively brief. I guess it's more of a preface. He provides a textual apparatus, by which I'm referring to the footnotes. So you can see footnotes like this three next to the Piraeus, the four next to Ariston. And these refer to footnotes that he appends to the very end of the book. And these notes are, you don't always have to look at them. You don't really ever have to look at them. But if you're ever sort of curious about what's being said in the text, or curious about what, especially these proper nouns, these proper names can mean, taking a quick look at the apparatus in the back can help make sense of them. And he also provides at the very, very end of the book, and I can show you in the table of contents here, right here, an interpretive essay starting on page 305. And then interpretive essay is very good. You're not required in any way, shape, or form to read it. I'm not saying it's the correct or incorrect interpretation, but if anything in this sort of piques your interest, um, if you just sort of find yourself wondering about Plato, or wondering about the Republic, or wondering about these sort of arguments that we're going to take to be as somewhat typical of ancient political thought, if any of this strikes you as interesting, a great place to read a little bit further is Bloom's interpretive essay. And so that's included in this PDF as well. I'm not going to say a whole lot about Plato. Plato is going to serve as our representative of ancient political thought for the purposes of this class. Um, the fact that we only have time for Plato is one of the drawbacks of the online format, and of actually, really, it's the format, not nothing to do necessarily with it being online, more to do with the fact that it's a truncated class. Summer two is only about 5 weeks long, rather than the full 14 weeks of a semester. And so we just don't have time to do everything. Ancient political thought might also include, besides Plato, it might also include other ancient Greek thinkers. So names like Aristotle, you're probably familiar with, Xenophon perhaps, and the Athenians more generally. It might also include other Greeks like the Spartans. So the Spartans themselves didn't write a whole lot, but we have accounts of Spartan political thinking and Spartan political practices. We find these in later sources like Plutarch, um, the sort of late, sort of the Roman chronicler of antiquity. Plutarch tells us a lot about Spartan society. We also get sort of firsthand accounts, I suppose you call them firsthand accounts, from Thucydides, Herodotus, and other classical sources. And if we were going to do this course in the course of a full term, we would spend a lot of time talking about Spartan thought, particularly because it makes a nice contrast with what Plato offers. The Spartans were very much a warrior culture. If you're familiar at all with the depictions of Spartan society in, for example, the movie 300, they were very much a sort of very close-knit, very militaristic society, exemplary of what we think of as the classical republican tradition. And the way that they build a society on the basis of martial virtue, i.e., the best citizens are those citizens who are most capable of serving in a military context, provides a nice contrast with what Plato is trying to do here, which is to try to shift political philosophy and political ethics away from the martial virtues, the virtues that are to do with essentially the ability to kill your enemies and to protect your homeland, to other moral questions like the question of justice. Uh, so, in other words, we have other examples of Greek thought within the purview of this thing called ancient political thought. And then, of course, we have um, a sort of giant field of Roman political thought that we're not going to touch on at all. But figures like Cicero, the Roman historians like Livy and Tacitus, Plutarch himself, all of these could be considered to fall under the banner of Roman political thought. And all of that can be considered to be part and parcel of ancient political thought more generally. Ancient political thought might also include some very early Christian thought. The name that most readily comes to mind is somebody like Augustine, Augustine of Hippo, whose City of God was published in the 5th century CE, and which represents a kind of interesting move away from certain classical themes and a move into the thing that we sometimes refer to as medieval political thought. Now, medieval political thought, we're going to skip entirely. So we are going to jump, and again, this is mostly to do with the constraints of the shortened term. We're going to jump from this first section, 4 or 5 days on Plato's Republic, and we're going to jump directly into Machiavelli. This is a leap of almost 2,000 years. It's going to skip Rome. It's going to skip the first 1,500 years, really, of Christianity, but we're going to do the best that we can with what is given to us. In terms of introducing this specific work, I don't want to say a whole lot other than to introduce you very quickly to the figure of Socrates and to explain a few things about him. So you've probably heard of both Plato and Socrates. If you've taken sort of AP Western Civ or AP Government or whatever, you might have been introduced to these figures. But it's enough to just point out, or just to refresh your memory, that there are two figures. One of them, his name is Socrates. He did not write anything, so we have no known writings of Socrates. What we know about Socrates is given to us by several of his students. The most prominent of these students is the guy that we're reading for today. His name is Plato. There are other students who wrote dialogues like Plato. Xenophon comes most immediately to mind. And there are other students of Plato who wrote things that aren't dialogues that tell us about the life of Socrates. But the important thing to note is that we know nothing. I'm sorry, we have nothing in hand that was written by Socrates directly. What we know of Socrates is the following. He is the first of what we consider to be the class of thing called a philosopher. The word philosophy is derived from the Greek philo, meaning love, and Sophia, meaning wisdom or knowledge. So a philosopher is one who loves wisdom. For Socrates, philosophy was not so much an occupation as it was a kind of way of life, and he took it very seriously. And by that I mean that part of the reason we don't know anything about Socrates is that he didn't spend a lot of time writing. He didn't spend a lot of time doing much at all. He was a stonemason by profession. He was a father and a husband, but we don't really know much about him in terms of his stonemasonry or in terms of his home life. In many ways, actually, the life of Socrates reflects the kind of general contours or the mythological features of the life of a guy like Jesus. Also had a trade, namely carpentry, also had a home life, but we don't really know much about or care much about how good of a carpenter Jesus was or what he was like as a brother, or whatever. Most we just care about what he thought and what he said. Likewise with Socrates. So Socrates spends a lot of his time in public spaces. He spends a lot of his time talking to young people. He spends a lot of his time arguing with others. He spends a lot of his time questioning the assumptions of others. And this practice of philosophy is a kind of unending conversation that's predicated on discussion, that's predicated on the give and take of reasons between individuals. This kind of practice made him a somewhat reputable figure in Athens. I should say, a somewhat disreputable figure in Athens. He was unloved. He was known for being ugly, i.e., like literally hard to look at, quite smelly, in fact. And he wasn't just unpleasant to look at, he was also unpleasant to be around. Anyone who questions everything is going to make themselves something of a nuisance. In another work, which you may have read, but you've probably heard of, another work written by Plato, but sometimes referred to as Socrates' Apology. Now, this word apology, this is a translation of the Greek apologia, which doesn't mean saying sorry, but rather means a defense. So in the apology, what we find is a depiction of something that apparently happened in real life, and it happened around the year 399 BCE. So if you know anything about Athenian history, you know that the Athenians and the Spartans fought a very long war, referred to as the Peloponnesian War. It lasted about half a century, and it ended with Athens's defeat and the imposition of something called the 30 Tyrants. So this was essentially tyrannical military rule of Sparta over Athens. This was a bad place to be in. And when it came time to assess who was responsible for what had happened to Athens in the course of the Peloponnesian War, one of the people that they came up with was Socrates. Now, there's various reasons for this. One reason is that some of Socrates's students ended up being among those 30 tyrants, those who were sort of assigned by Sparta to rule tyrannically over Athens. Some of the figures, namely a guy named Alcibiades, who led to the defeat of Athens at the hands of Sparta, were students of Socrates. And more than this, Socrates was just kind of a pain in the butt. People didn't like him. People considered him a nuisance. And so it came time in 399 to let him know how much of a nuisance they considered him. And he was brought up in Athens on charges of impiety. Impiety, corrupting the youth, undermining or subverting the public morality of Athens. And so the apology is a kind of account of that trial. So Socrates is accused of having acted impiously and of having subverted these Athenian traditions. He stands on trial to about 300 Athenian citizens, selected mostly at random. These would have been exclusively men, but they would have been selected at random. And he's asked to defend himself. And so he defends his life of philosophy. He says he considers himself to be a kind of gadfly or like a horsefly, that he says by pestering those around him, by pestering the Athenians with questions about what the nature of the good is, what the nature of justice is, he hopes to wake them, the giant slumbering horse of Athens. He hopes to wake it and to rouse it and to improve it. The Athenians were unmoved by Socrates's defense. He was found guilty of having subverted or been impious, having subverted the traditions of Athens. And when called upon to recommend his own punishment, Socrates very cheekily recommends that he be given meals for life in the Prytaneum, which was a kind of a meal hall that was reserved for Athens' greatest citizens. So he's like, oh, if you find me guilty of having acted impiously, then you should give me the reward that I deserve. Namely, I should be honored as among the greatest heroes of Athens. So again, pretty cheeky. Um, they didn't like that, and unsurprisingly, they condemned him to death. And so in 399 BCE, Socrates was administered hemlock, and he drank hemlock, and he died because of it. So he dies something of a martyr. A martyr to what? To something like philosophy. Now, the reason why I introduce this is because it's important to keep in mind as we work through the Republic this particular background. Plato watches Socrates die at the hands of the Athenian demos. Demos is a good word. This means the people. The Greeks, and especially the Greeks that we care about, the Greek political philosophers, had a very dim view of the demos. Um, they sometimes refer to the demos as the hoi polloi. You can find this term still in use today. If you pick up a copy of the New York Review of Books or something like that, you might see the phrase hoi polloi, and it means what we sometimes in popular phrase mean by the masses, right? So the people can be good, right? Like when Lincoln talks about a government of for and by the people, there's a kind of dignity to the phrase the people. The masses, however, are always bad. And so somebody like Plato is going to be very characteristically opposed to the people. And why? Because the people, unwilling to be improved by Socrates, killed him instead. And so, always in the background of the Republic, we have this threat in this question of um, political life, which often depends on the will of the people, the opinions of the people, what the Greeks sometimes refer to as the dogmas of the people, which is to say their beliefs, their opinions about things. We find that the will of the people sometimes runs against um, uh, moral considerations like justice, for example. So the people can often be quite vindictive. The people can often be um, fearful or mistrustful of things that they don't understand. They can often be fearful or mistrustful of those that they find to not be sufficiently of them or like them. And so, always in the background of the Republic, there's this question of like, what is the role of philosophy? What is the role of moral theorizing and moral deliberation? What is the role of that in political life? And we find, too, this question throughout the Republic, we find Plato sort of working through the question of like, how do we make philosophy and political life? How do we allow these things to go together? How do we make political life more welcoming of philosophy, and how do we sort of attune philosophical findings for political life? And we can see this like fundamental question. We can see this fundamental dispute already on page one. There's this kind of very not page one, I guess, on page three. So I'm going to just talk over a PDF copy of the book, and we'll sort of work through it together. But we see almost immediately there's a conflict, and it's a conflict between Socrates and several of what would become, here's another word you might want to know, what would become his interlocutors. Interlocutors are those who are engaged in interlocution, which is to say, those who are engaged in a kind of conversation and specifically a kind of edifying or rewarding, enriching sort of conversation. So Socrates, in the Republic more general, features a number of interlocutors. We're going to meet three of them, three primary ones in this chapter. Their names are Cephalus, Polemarchus, and I didn't need to write the word and Thrasymachus. And we'll talk about each of these in turn. So there's an initial confrontation that happens here. So Socrates, says this. Socrates, I went down to the Piraeus yesterday with Glaucon, son of Ariston, to pray to the goddess. And at the same time, I wanted to observe how they would put on the festival since they were now holding it for the first time. Now, in my opinion, the procession of the native inhabitants was fine, but the one the Thracians conducted was no less fitting a show. After we had prayed and looked on, we went off toward town. Catching sight of us from afar as we were pressing homewards, Polemarchus, son of Cephalus, ordered his slave boy to run after us and to order us to wait for him. The boy took hold of my cloak from behind and said, Polemarchus orders you to wait. So a couple of things to note here at the beginning. So on the one hand, we have Socrates down at what's called the Piraeus. And again, the apparatus in the back will tell you what these things mean. That there's a footnote, you can look it up in the back. But I'll just tell you what the Piraeus is. So if we think about Athens, Athens sits much higher than the sea, but at the same time, it is a port city. Like this is actually the source of much of the Athenian wealth at the time, was the fact that it had a grand navy, but a grand commercial empire as well that was based on seafaring activity. And so the city of Athens has a kind of port, which is to say it has a harbor area where the ships come and go, and that is the Piraeus. But of course, if we think topographically, we note that by definition, this will need to be lower than the city. So there's a sense in which the Piraeus is like topographically lower, but it's also lower in the sense that what is available to be done in the Piraeus is the kind of things that you would expect to be available in ports. You have sailors who have been out for a long time. They're back in town. They want to have a good time. They bring with them a lot of wealth, a lot of goods from elsewhere. And so the Piraeus is a kind of place where we can indulge in what we might think of as like the low passions, right? So it's a place that we go to eat and drink and have fun. Sailors, presumably, right? They like to curse and they like to find prostitutes. So both of those will be available. You note that he's down there at a religious festival, but you got to realize, pre-Christian religious festivals, pagan religious festivals, weren't really solemn affairs. So despite being religious, they were a pretty good time was to be had. So Socrates is down with his friend Glaucon, and they're having a good time, and they're watching these games, and they're about to head back to Athens when they are ordered. Again, the word here is Polemarchus orders you to wait. So Polemarchus shows up and he says, Socrates, I guess you two are hurrying to get away to town. It's not a bad guess, I said. Well, he said, do you see how many of us there are? Now, that's a really weird thing to say. It's very odd to say, Socrates, it's good to see you. I see you're about to leave, but do you notice how many of us there are? Right. So this is a threat. And Polemarchus is saying, you're about to leave, but I don't want you to leave. And before you say anything about it, please note that there are much more of us than there are of you. Well, he said, of course, do you see how many of us there are? Of course. Well, then, he said, either prove stronger than these men or stay here. Top of this page. Isn't there still one other possibility? I said, our persuading you that you must let us go. Could you really persuade, he said, if we don't listen? So here is an interesting conundrum. Polemarchus shows up and he's like, listen, Socrates, I want you to stay. I want you to stay and talk with us. And I don't really care what you want to do because you can't overpower me. And on top of that, you can't convince me otherwise because I just won't listen to you. Right. So Polemarchus represents, and we'll talk about what his name means and who he is in the story. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Polemarchus sort of comes in and he represents, in some sense, the threat, and that it is the threat posed by the people, right? The masses who are big and powerful and instinctual. There's so many of them, and ultimately they're often quite dumb in the sense that they don't listen and they won't be persuaded, and they're unwilling to listen those that they don't like. Okay, so Socrates and his friend Glaucon, they agree to join to a nearby home with Polemarchus and his crew. It turns out that this home is the home of a guy named Cephalus. So we see here in the middle of the page, Cephalus, Polemarchus' father, was also at home, and he seemed very old to me, for I had not seen him for some time. He was seated on a sort of cushioned stool and was crowned with a wreath, for he just performed a sacrifice in the courtyard. So Cephalus is Polemarchus's father, and it's from Cephalus that we get the first definition of justice. So what kind of characteristics does Cephalus have? We find out that he's old, and we find out that he's wealthy. We find out that he has been reflecting a lot about certain pleasures. He talks a bit about sex, which is kind of fun, I suppose. Um, he talks a lot about losing the desire for sex. And one of the things that we note from this discussion is that Kepler has lost this desire, but he's lost a lot of desires. So he no longer has the desires of a young man, and this has, for him, been a good thing. It's allowed him to sort of focus on what's important. And we find that he's interested, or he's concerned, I should say, with what's going to come next. He's worried about what will happen to him in the next life. So he's become very religious. He has become very concerned with being viewed as a good person, of having been just. And so very quickly, Socrates says, okay, this sounds good. I like this idea of being just. I like this idea of wondering what our punishments or our rewards in the next life will be. And so, what is it that you mean, Cephalus? What is it that you mean about justice? What does it mean that you think it is? So we get already here, right off the bat, we get our first definition of justice. Now, this book one is built around three definitions of justice that Socrates solicits from his interlocutors and that he provides refutations for. Now, the thing to learn about these three definitions of justice and what you're going to want to sort of do with them, you want to know which definition of justice comes from which person, and you want to know why that definition of justice is the kind of definition of justice that they would hold. So the first one, we got this old man, Cephalus. He's old, he's pretty wealthy, he's going to die soon. What he thinks justice is the following. So here I'm on page 7. Again, you can just follow along with the video here and the highlighted portion. And by the way, so at times I'll refer to the page numbers, which are at the bottom. These are the page numbers provided by the press in the manuscript that they publish. But there's also these page numbers on the right, which are called Stephanos paginations. And essentially, these are kind of universal paginations for all copies of Plato that some medieval monk put together. So I'll often just make use of these because they're a little more precise than the page number. So at 331c, we read the following. What you say is very fine indeed, Cephalus, I said, but as to this very thing, justice, shall we so simply assert that it is the truth in giving back what a man has taken from another, or is to do these very things sometimes just and sometimes unjust? So he doesn't say this super clearly here, but what we can say is that the definition of justice put forth by Cephalus is that justice is telling telling the truth and paying your debts, some combination of that, paying your debts and telling the truth, whatever. Now, of course, this seems like the kind of definition of justice that would appeal to Cephalus. After all, he's an old man and he has a lot of money. So paying debts isn't terribly difficult for him. And telling the truth isn't terribly different for him because, like, he's rich. It's very easy to tell the truth when you're rich because you don't really suffer a lot of consequences for stating truths that are difficult for others to deal with. So Cephalus's definition of justice, what justice is telling the truth and paying your debts. And that a just man, therefore, is one who has told the truth and has paid his debts. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. And what we find is that Socrates refutes it or provides a refutation for it almost immediately. And he does this here. Take this case as an example of what I mean. Everyone would surely say that if a man takes weapons from a friend when the latter is of sound mind and the friend demands them back when he is mad, one shouldn't give back such things, and the man who gave them back would not be just, and moreover, one should not be willing to tell someone in this state the whole truth. What you say is right, he said. So Cephalus comes in, gives a definition of justice. Socrates immediately points out what's wrong with it, and Cephalus is like, yep, you know what, you're right. And not only does he say, you know what, you're right, he almost immediately leaves. So you say, what you say is right, then this isn't the definition of justice, speaking the truth and giving back what one takes. It most certainly is, Socrates, interrupted Polemarchus. So now we have a shift in interlocutor from Cephalus to Polemarchus. At least if Simonides should be believed at all. Oh, crap. Boy, didn't you do that? At least if Simonides, oh, they're not going to. At least if Simonides should be believed at all. Well, then, said Cephalus, I hand down the argument to you, for it's already time for me to look after the sacrifices. So a couple things going on here. One, we should be clear on what Socrates has said. So the definition of justice is telling the truth and paying your debts. And Socrates' reputation is like, listen, we can adapt this for modern times. If you have a friend and he's lent you his shotgun and he shows up to your house and you can tell he's in an agitated state, and maybe it looks like, I don't know, that he's been taking meth or something like that. And he's like, listen, uh, I'm in an agitated state, and I want to go, I don't know, shoot up my ex-wife's house or something like that. Can I have that shotgun back? So, according to this definition of justice, the just man is required to pay his debts, meaning to give back what is owed. And so, despite the fact that the shotgun is going to be used to commit these heinous crimes, you are nonetheless obligated, as a matter of justice, to give the shotgun back. So that would seem to sort of not mesh with our intuitions about what we mean by justice. So it would seem that justice is either something more or something less than always paying one's debts. And of course, the same can be said of telling the truth, right? If he shows up and he's like, "Where's the shotgun?" Um, uh, telling the justice requiring you to tell the truth would just require you to say where the shotgun is. Whereas, we might say, well, in that case, I might lie to him. We might say, well, I left over at my cousin Randy's house or something like that and send him on a wild goose chase just to prevent this bad result from happening. So, definition of justice that Kepler offers is refuted by this example of the crazed person who wants their weapon back. Okay, so another thing to note is that Kepler isn't really interested in talking about this much further, and in fact, he leaves. He leaves to go do some religious stuff, right? So he leaves to go to church, and he hands the argument down to Polemarchus. Now, some interpreters have pointed out that like Kepler, he's an old man, and there's a sense in which like old people are not really well suited for philosophy. So, yeah, there's a bit of gerontphobia here, kind of bigotry against the old. Socrates himself wasn't exactly young when this supposedly takes place. But the idea is like if you spend a lot of time talking to old people, they're not likely to change their mind. Like they have pretty set views on things. They don't really want to discuss sort of unusual or radical topics, right? Like if you're, I don't know, if you're interested in, you know, in issues related to like gender or sexuality or something like that, right? There are some interlocutors who would be better to talk these things over with, and some who would be worse. And typically, you don't want to talk to grandma about, gender fluidity, the idea of gender fluidity or something like that, because grandma's going to have grandma's views on the issue. So there's a sense in which like Keflos kind of has to go in order for the conversation to really get started. Because we can't entertain these sort of universal questions in the presence of somebody like him. Okay, and note that he passes it on to Polemarchus. And we know too from this description that Polemarchus is the heir of Keflos. So he's the heir to the argument. He's also the heir of the man. So Polemarchus, Kepler is an old and rich man. Polemarchus is someone who stands to inherit Kepler's fortune. So Polemarchus is a feature. He's going to be one of the three most important people in this dialogue. He's an important guy for a couple of reasons. So, like he stands to inherit a great fortune, which means he's probably been sort of trained up in certain arts that will make him important in Athens. And in particular, he's probably been trained up in sort of military arts. So in the fourth century BCE, if you wanted to be important in Athens, if you wanted to be a great man, you needed to be skilled in a couple of things. One of the things you needed to be skilled at was skilled in argument. So you needed to be a good orator, able to sway the masses when you spoke to them, but you also needed to just sort of be martially virtuous. So you needed to be a general or a figure of some military importance. So Polemarchus's name, we're back here. Polemarchus's name is actually an interesting conjunction of two words here. Let's see if I can't get it to reproduce the Greek exactly. So his name is a combination of two Greek words here. So one of them is polemios. So polemios basically means like war or combatant. If you're familiar with the word polemic or polemical, all right, this is the same root. So polemios meaning war or combatant plus archos, polemarchos, archos meaning sort of chief or high or even command. So in the way that like there are arch enemies and arch angels, for example, who are sort of like chief angels and chief enemies. So his name means something like warrior, or really something closer to general or a kind of warrior statesman. So he's going to be an important guy. He's going to be a rich guy, and he's going to be politically important in Athens, which means he's going to have some connection to sort of martial activities, war-making activities. Right? So Athens is a city-state. Athens does war, which means that Athens needs these great men who are going to lead them in battle and lead them at home as well. So if we think about American history, there has been, and not just American history, I mean just histories of politics the world over, there's always been a link between the ability or the capacity for violence, especially violence through the conduct of war on the one hand, and political power on the other. So America's had a number of sort of warrior statesmen. So Eisenhower comes to mind, Grant comes to mind. Many of the very early presidents, I mean, Washington comes most readily to mind, the first president who also led the Continental armies. And of course, the very great presidents are often those presidents who led us through war in one way or another. We think about Lincoln, we think about FDR and Truman. Um, so there is this connection, and Polemarchus is this guy. So there's a sense in which he kind of represents like normal politics, right? So like the mass politics. He's the kind of guy that the masses want to lead him. Why? Because he's good at war and he's good at being great. That's what Polemarchus is. That's what he is. That's what he represents. One final note, real quick. Note that he cites Simonides. This name Simonides. Simonides was a poet. One of the things that you'll find kind of key for unlocking the Republic is that anytime somebody brings an argument that a poet made, Socrates is usually about to demolish it. Socrates hates poets. Poets stands for kind of like art in all of its meanings. So he considered Socrates and Plato after him considered poetry or art to be a lower form of understanding. So a poet can sometimes represent what is good and just, but a poet doesn't really have the capacity to explain why it's good and just. And so the poet can often mislead. And so it's unsurprising then to find Paul Marcus coming in and citing Simonides and then giving a bad argument. And so he takes over the argument from Kepler. Kepler says that justice is telling the truth and paying your debts. Polemarchus comes in and he sort of refines it, right? He says, well, what telling the truth and paying your debts means is something like giving to each what is owed. Okay, giving to each what is owed. That's actually not a terrible definition of justice. And then they kind of pursue this a little bit, and then they end up here on page 8 saying something like the following. Then I said, this is Socrates speaking, it seems that Simonides made a riddle after the fashion of poets when he said what the just is, for it looks as if he thought that it is just to give to everyone what is fitting. In this he gave the name what is owed. What else do you think in the name of blah, 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 blah. All right, now then, the art that gives what to which things would be called justice. If the answer has to be consistent with what preceded Socrates, he said, the one that gives benefits and harms to friends and enemies. Does he mean that justice is doing good to friends and harm to enemies, in my opinion? Okay, so here we are then at um, Polemarchus's definition of justice. So let's pull up our little sheet here. What is Polemarchus's definition of justice? The second definition of justice we encounter is that justice is doing good to friends and bad to enemies. Now, of course, this is the kind of definition of justice that would appeal to a guy like Polemarchus. After all, he's going to be he's going to be a military figure. Like, what does a general do? What does a soldier do? Like, what is the mission? The mission of a general or a soldier is to give as much pain as possible, to give as much suffering as possible, to kill the enemy, and in so doing, to provide things for our friends. So, justice is doing good to friends, doing bad to enemies. This is a distinctly political response to the question of what justice is. And Socrates provides a couple of refutations. So there's this kind of odd discussion here about justice as an essentially idle art. We don't need to make much of this. We can just kind of jump up to page 11. And here is what Socrates responds. And we can call this the Osama bin Laden refutation. of Polemarchus' definition of justice. So we see at Stephanos' pagination 334c, do you mean by friends those who seem to be good to an individual, or those who are, even if they don't seem to be, and similarly with enemies? It's likely, he said, that the men one believes to be good, one loves, while those he considers bad, one hates. But don't human beings make mistakes about this, so that many seem to them to be good, although they are not, and vice versa? They do make mistakes. So for them, the good are enemies and the bad are friends, certainly. But nevertheless, it's still just for them to help the bad and harm the good. It looks like it. Yet the good are just in such as not to do injustice. True. Then, according to your argument, it's just to treat badly men who have done nothing unjust. Not at all, Socrates, he said, for the argument seems to be bad. Then, after all, I said, it's just to harm the unjust and help the just. This looks finer than what was just said. Then, for many, Polemarchus, all human beings who make mistakes, it will turn out to be just to harm friends, for their friends are bad, and just to help enemies, for they are good. So we shall say the very opposite of what was asserted, of what we asserted Simonides means. So here's the basic issue. Friends and enemies, which is to say nothing of harm and good, um, friends and enemies aren't always apparent. It's not always super clear who are our friends and who are our enemies, which is another way of saying that it's not always super clear who is just and who is unjust, who is good and who is bad. On top of that, it's not always super clear what we ought to give to our friends in order to help them and what we ought to give to our enemies in order to harm them. So the problem with Paul Marcus's definition of justice is that, this actually, we can attribute this to a certain soldierly ethos. It's that it's an unintelligent, or it lacks a certain element of judgment. Right? We need to have some education, some idea of what makes someone good or a friend, and need to have some estimate of what makes it a help. Likewise, with the opposite, we need to have some idea, some clear notion of what makes someone bad or what makes someone an enemy, and what it would mean to harm them. So I call this the Osama bin Laden rejection because, as you probably know, Osama bin Laden, who organized the terrorist attacks of 9/11, Osama bin Laden, before he attacked America on 9/11, Osama bin Laden was actually helped by America. He was provided with funds and with arms in the 1980s. The Taliban, more generally, was helped out in this way, as the U.S. tried to fund a proxy front against Russia, who was in a military conflict with Afghanistan at that time. So the fact is, we didn't know who Osama bin Laden was. He seemed to be a friend. Why? Because he was an enemy of the Russians. And so we gave him what we thought were good things, namely funds. And it turned out that we were wrong about that. It turned out that in acting justly in this way, i.e., by in helping our friends, we simultaneously acted unjustly because we helped our enemies. So this is one problem with this definition of justice. There's another sort of related problem that appears on page 13, and that is this. So he goes through this sort of long discussion, and he ends with this phrase at the top of 13, 335d. He asks this question. So is if justice means doing harm to enemies, what does that actually mean? So if we have a horse that's acting in a way that we don't like, is acting in a very unhorse-like fashion, if we harmed it, say by whipping it or by harming it in some way, by maiming it in some way, are we going to make it a better or a worse horse? And the answer is probably something like a worse horse, which means that in that case, we seem to have done something unjust, right? So if we have an enemy, if we have someone who's acting in an unjust fashion, if we're just to reach out and strike them, or if we are to make them in some way even more unjust than they previously were, then we ourselves would be acting in a kind of unjust fashion. So for Plato, or for, I should say, for Socrates, it's extremely important that when we say we're acting justly, when we say that we're doing good to friends and harm to enemies, we have to have a very clear notion of what it means to do good and what it means to do harm, right? So sometimes, so in the case of education, for example, if one of my kids is trying to is learning piano or something like that, and they refuse to practice. So if I force them, if I say, listen, no more screen time until you go through piano, that would seem to be harming them in some way. At least there's a certain vantage from which I am harming them. Like, namely, they want to care, they want to watch TV or whatever, but instead they're going to have to do piano lessons. And yet at the same time, we might say that it was nonetheless just because it improved them in some way. So just helping our friends and killing our enemies doesn't really seem to be sufficient to say that we're acting justly because we're not really improving anyone in the way that Polemarchus has set it out. Okay, so a couple things happen after this argument concludes. One, we get this odd line right here in the middle of page 13, right above 336a, where Socrates says, "We shall do battle then as partners, you and I." I said, "If someone asserts that Simonides or Bias or Pittacus or any other wise and blessed man said it, I, for one," he said, "am ready to be your partner in the battle." So if we think back to what we just saw, where Polemarchus represents a kind of threat to Socrates, and of course, this threat is meant to reflect in some way the threat that the city, the masses in Athens, posed to Socrates. We can see throughout the first six or seven, uh, six, seven, we see throughout the first six or seven books of the Republic, we see this kind of recurrent theme of Socrates sort of trying to recruit Polemarchus to his side, and of Polemarchus being willing to say that, yes, I see what you mean now. I see that you are my better, at least with respect to thinking about the question of justice, and I'm willing to be your partner. Okay, so we see that happen here. Now, uh, this weird thing happens, and a third definition of justice emerges. The third definition of justice is from a guy that we saw named Thrasymachus. And Thrasymachus, his name is pretty cool. So his name kind of means like the tyrant, but it also means a kind of beast, like a rough beast, um, uh, who is dangerous in some way. And so we see Thrasymachus jumping in here at the bottom of 13. This is a 333b. Now, Thrasymachus had many times started out to take over the argument in the midst of our discussion, but he'd been restrained by the men sitting near him who wanted to hear the argument out. But when we paused and I said this, he could no longer keep quiet. Hunched up like a wild beast, he flung himself at us as if to tear us to pieces. And both Polemarchus and I got all in a flutter from fright. So, who is Thrasymachus? He's an interesting guy. And we note that what he really doesn't like is Socrates. And he doesn't like the way that Socrates talks. He doesn't like the way that Socrates argues. He doesn't like what he calls here on page 14, the habitual irony of Socrates. So Socrates is ironical. In fact, we actually have this term, Socratic irony. And what Socratic irony means, at least in this instance, is a kind of very knowing way of talking. So Socrates can often manage to say one thing while meaning another. And this is his sort of ironic pose. So he'll often refer to Thrasymachus as the best of men, and that he's just a humble inquirer, and he's nobody compared to Thrasymachus, but we know that he doesn't actually believe this. So there's a sense in which Socrates always sort of keeps his true opinion behind, and he's always sort of just using questions as a way of getting people sort of off their guard a little bit and of making his point seem almost like it's coming from them. So he hates this irony of Socrates, and he hates his way of asking questions. Two, we see that, so here on page 15, um, we see that Thrasymachus, he says, I have an answer. I know exactly what justice is. And not only do I know exactly what justice is, I can tell you, and I won't tell you by just saying, by just talking for a long time. And I won't tell you by asking questions. And I won't give you an ironical definition of justice. I'm just going to tell you what it is. And let's see at the top 15, I want you to pay me for it. That's because you're an agreeable chap, he said. But in addition to learning, pay a fine in money too. So Thrasymachus is an example of a sophist, someone who practices sophistry. Now, sophists, there was the kind of Greek sense. So sophists were what we might think of today as like other philosophers who went around Greece at the time. But what distinguishes them, and Socrates is very, very fussy about this, what distinguishes them from Socrates and what distinguishes them from the philosophical way of life as Socrates understood it was the fact that they were professional, that this was their occupation. So they went around, and particularly what sophists would do is they would they would offer, typically to wealthy men, they would offer to train up their sons in like legal and political speech making. So they would offer to teach them how to make arguments, how to make arguments seem persuasive. They would teach them, in other words, how to sort of carry on war with words. Um, and so Thrasymachus, he says, I've got a definition of justice right here. I've got it at hand. It's going to be very, very sharp. Like this is a definition of justice that will be able to accomplish argumentative battle. Like it will be extremely useful in battle. And as befits someone who provides you a weapon, I want to be paid for it. Um, Sophistry today, you can use this word today. If you could accuse someone of sophistry today, what you mean is you're making an argument and you don't really mean it, or you're making an argument mostly in order to score points or in order to make money. And actually, it's an interesting term to have about today because we live in the age of social media, right? Where influencers, political influencers on both sides of things will get on Twitter or get on their podcasts or whatever and just say outrageous and stupid shit, and they say outrageous and stupid shit, not because they actually believe it, not because anyone could actually believe these things, but they say it mostly because they want you to click and they want you to subscribe and they want you to pay them in some way or the other. And of course, one of the defining characteristics of the outrageous and stupid shit that they say is that it's the kind of outrageous and stupid shit that wins arguments, right? It's the kind of outrageous and stupid shit that often sort of beggars belief and typically presents itself as a kind of overwhelming force in the and especially like if we think about like the sort of culture of like debate me, debate me, debate me, and this whole idea that we're going to find the truth by sort of the sort of rough and tumble debate atmosphere, we can see sophistry on full display there. Okay, so Thrasymachus comes in, he says outrageous and stupid shit, and what does he say justice is? He says that justice is what he calls the interest of the stronger. Now, this is a kind of an odd thing to say, and he'll offer a couple refinements of this, but we can start off with justice is the interest of the stronger. So at the bottom of 15, this is 338c. Now listen, he said, I say that the just is nothing other than the advantage of the stronger. Well, why don't you praise me, but you won't be willing? And so Socrates immediately like, well, this isn't super clear what you mean by the advantage of the stronger. What do you mean by that exactly? So here is how Thrasymachus refines this. It comes on the very next page, page 16. He says, so this is at 338, like between D and E. Don't you know, he said, some cities are ruled tyrannically, some democratically, and some aristocratically. Of course, and each city isn't the ruling group master, certainly. And each ruling group sets down laws for its advantage. A democracy sets down democratic laws, a tyranny, tyrannic laws, and the others do the same. And they declare that what they have set down, their own advantage, is just for the ruled, and the man who departs from it they punish as a breaker of the law and a doer of unjust deeds. This, best of men, is what I mean. In every city, the same thing is just the advantage of the established ruling body. It surely is master. So the man who reasons rightly concludes that everywhere justice is the same thing, the advantage of the stronger. So this is a kind of a curious argument, and we can say that generally what he means is this. What he means is like in any society, in any place that we find what we think of as the legal manifestations of justice, so where we see laws and we see courts and we see punishments, anytime you find a society like this, there will be the strongest. There will be some element of the society which is strongest. So you can think this is the rich, you can think this is the masses, you can think this is the aristocracy. It doesn't really make any difference. Someone in that society is going to be the strongest. Those people are going to create the legal system, the system of justice that's in place, and that system of justice will, almost by definition, benefit them. Right? So if you think that the real power behind our laws is the wealthy, then what you think is, well, they're the strongest. They've set up a legal system that benefits them. Right? So what is justice? Justice is whatever benefits the rich. If you think that the society is led by some political faction, right? So if you think society is that the Democrats are the ascendant faction in our society and that they're going to make laws, which laws they're going to make? They're going to make the laws that benefit them. So justice in that case, i.e., those systems of law and of punishment that we refer to when we talk about the justice system, those are going to be set up by the powerful, and the powerful will always set them up to their benefit. So this actually isn't I mean, there's a sense in which this is sort of deeply profound, but it's also not profound. So it's not profound in the sense that this is obviously true. It's obviously true that everywhere there is going to be the strongest, and everywhere the strongest are going to have some hand in determining the system of justice that's in place. What Thrasymachus actually wants to wring out of this definition is this idea that there is no such thing as justice. There is only the stronger and what is to their advantage. Like that's all what he ends up the argument that he wants to make is that justice has no independent standing outside of what the strong say ought to be the case. So Socrates offers a couple refutations of this. These aren't terribly persuasive, but they are at least going through. So the first one he makes is this kind of fallibility argument. So he says, well, okay, fine. Say I'm an autocrat, right? Say I rule as a dictator over this particular society. Wouldn't you say that it must be just for my followers, the denizens of my autocracy? Wouldn't you say that it must be the case that justice requires that they obey me? In other words, that it's always to my advantage for my subjects, to those who are weaker, to obey what the strong say justice requires. And of course, Thrasymachus has to give them this. If justice means the advantage of the stronger, then clearly obedience is part of that. Well, what if, and again, I'm the ruler here, what if I'm genuinely mistaken about what's in my interest, right? So what if I wake up one morning and I'm like, I have a terrible headache, I'm terribly hungover, and for whatever reason today, for the first time, I've realized that the solution to my hangover will be this, will be ingesting arsenic or, holding a loaded shotgun to my head and pulling the trigger or something like that. So I'm the autocrat, and I'm convinced that the way to cure my hangover will be to be fed arsenic in this way. And I command my inferiors, I command my subjects to provide me with the arsenic and maybe even to shovel the arsenic into my mouth. Okay. So in this case, if I'm the subject, justice demands that I obey, that I do what my superior commands of me, but at the same time, my superior is mistaken about what's in their interest. And so I, in killing him, would be both acting to his advantage and his disadvantage simultaneously. Okay. So that's the basic argument. Thrasymachus hates this, and he's like, Socrates, I knew you were going to do this. I knew you were going to make this stupid argument. And so he sort of refines it a little bit, and he ends up saying that no, it's not that. What it ends up being is something like, um, um, uh, what we mean by justice is those actions which are to our benefit as individuals. And so he comes up to this weird argument. Socrates advances a little bit later. So this is page 20. Socrates says, okay, so set aside for a moment this question of fallibility. Let's think about the art of governing. Isn't it the case that most arts are done for the sake of the thing over which they are practiced? Right. So if we think about the art of medicine is not conducted on behalf of the doctor. The art of medicine is conducted on behalf of the patient. And likewise, any other arts, the art of husbandry is not undertaken on behalf of the husbandman. It's undertaken on behalf of the horse, et cetera, et cetera. So on page 20, Socrates argues, but Thrasymachus, the arts rule and are masters of that which they are arts. He considered this too, but with a great deal of resistance. Then there is no kind of knowledge that considers or commands the advantage of the stronger, but rather of what is weaker and ruled by it. Bottom of the page, is that like 342e. Therefore, Thrasymachus, I said, there isn't ever anyone who holds any position of rule insofar as he is ruler who considers or commands his own advantage rather than that of what is ruled and of which he himself is the craftsman. And it is looking to this and what is advantageous and fitting for it that he says everything he says and does everything he does. Okay, so this is the second refutation, what he takes to be a refutation. The first is the fallibility refutation. And the second one is this sort of the nature of art refutation. So in the same way that medicine is practiced on behalf of its subject, so ruling, the art of ruling, is practiced on behalf of its subject, which is to say that if justice belongs to the art of ruling, which it must, then to be just is to act in some way on behalf of the subject of ruling, which is the ruled, right? So the art of medicine is practiced to heal the body. Therefore, the art of ruling must be practiced to do some good to the ruled. It can't just be to the benefit of the ruler. Um, and Thrasymachus hates this. And he's immediately like, well, no, hold on. There are arts in which this isn't the case. So there are arts, for example, like shepherding. So if I'm a shepherd, I'm practicing my art, my shepherding. I'm not doing it on behalf of the sheep, which is actually a questionable argument. But nonetheless, I'm not doing it on behalf of the sheep. I'm doing it on my behalf. So I'm being nice to these sheep now. But the reason I'm being nice to the sheep is because I need them nice and fat and safe because I'm going to slaughter them later or because I'm going to shear them later. So ultimately, shepherding is on behalf of the shepherd. And so this leads him to this somewhat different argument on page 21, which goes a little bit something like this. In the sections that I've highlighted here, which are in the middle of the page. This must be considered most simple, Socrates. The just man everywhere has less than the unjust man. First, in contracts, when the just man is a partner of the unjust man, you will always find that at the dissolution of the partnership, the just man does not have any more than the unjust man, but less. Second, in matters pertaining to the city, when there are taxes, the just man pays more on the basis of equal property, the unjust man less. And when there are distributions, the one makes no profit, the other much. And further, when each holds some ruling office, even if the just man suffers no other penalty, it is his lot to see his domestic affairs deteriorate from neglect, while he gets no advantage from the public store, thanks to his being just. In addition to this, he incurs the ill will of his relatives and his acquaintances when he is unwilling to serve them against what is just. The unjust man's situation is the opposite in all these respects. I am speaking of the man I now spoke of, the one who is able to get the better in a big way. Consider him if you want to judge how much more to his private advantage the unjust is than the just. You will learn most easily of all if you turn to the most perfect injustice, which makes the one who does injustice most happy, and those who suffer it would not be willing to do injustice most wretched. So it kind of shifts the subject a little bit here, and it's kind of odd. So we end up saying, okay, fine. If you want to talk about justice, let's talk about the character of justice or the quality of justice or what justice does to the person who practices it. When we act justly, i.e., when we obey the rules of propriety or whatever we think justice is, we typically come out worse for it. But when we act unjustly, we typically come out the better for it, right? So if we're in a situation where we're each going to take our share of a pie, say, right? If I observe what justice requires and I only take my fair portion, I'm going to get that which is due to me and that alone. But if I act unjustly, I'm going to get more, right? So acting unjustly, Thrasymachus says, means acting according to our advantage, which means acting in a way where we get as much as we want. And he offers that, right, and this is the kind of ceasing, the kind of clinching argument, the unjust man will always be happier than the just man. Justice is a kind of compromise. It's a kind of thing we have to begrudgingly do in order to get along with others. But injustice is great. Injustice means being smart. It means being smarter than everyone else. It means taking more than our fair share. It means always getting a bigger slice of the pie, always coming out on top. That's injustice, Thrasymachus says, and that's what you want to be in life. The last lines of this paragraph here in 334. See, so Socrates, injustice, when it comes into being on a sufficient scale, is mightier, freer, and more masterful than justice. And as I said from the beginning, the just is the advantage of the stronger, and the unjust is what is profitable and advantageous for oneself. So this sets off like a series of arguments that we're not really going to pay a lot of attention to. Because it's kind of an odd argument. It's not particularly important. What I want to draw your attention to is a couple of arguments that that Socrates makes towards the end. On the one hand, he points out that there are certain downsides to injustice. And so he points out on page 30, this is at 351 C and D, uh, I am full of wonder, Thrasymachus, I said, because you not only nod and shake your head, but also give very fine answers. It's because I'm gratifying you, he said. It's good of you to do so, but gratify me this much more and tell me, do you believe that either a city or an army or pirates or robbers or any other tribe which is some common unjust enterprise would be able to accomplish anything if its members acted unjustly to one another? Surely not, he said. And what if they didn't act unjustly? Wouldn't they be more able to accomplish something? Certainly, he said. For surely Thrasymachus, it's injustice that produces factions, hatreds, and quarrels among themselves, and justice that produces unanimity and friendship. Isn't it so? Let it be so, so as not to differ with you. So you're familiar with the idea that there is honor among thieves. And what we mean by the phrase honor among thieves is like any collective enterprise, even if that collective enterprise is just like banditry, working together as thieves. Thieves themselves, there must be a code of honor between them because if you're trying to work together on something, even if that thing is bad, even if that thing is thieving, you still need to be able to rely on those around you to conduct themselves in certain ways. You need them to obey certain rules. So honor among thieves means that like if we rob a place together and we're successful and we split it evenly, that means we're going to be able to coordinate our conduct in the future, which is good. So Socrates makes a kind of very basic point, which is like any sort of coordinated efforts require rule following. Any sort of coordinated efforts require trust. And if an unjust man is just always trying to rip everyone off, if they're just constantly trying to get the better of everyone else, if they're always trying to look like the smart one, if they're always trying to get the biggest share of things, then they're just going to alienate everybody, including other bad people that they're trying to align with, that they're trying to um, organize with. And so he says injustice is always going to break down. It's always going to be subject to quarrel and faction, and they're never going to be a big group of unjust people. Instead, just people, because they're able to organize, because they're able to pool their efforts collectively, even if those efforts are bad, just people will always have this advantage over unjust ones. They'll always be stronger in this sense. And Thrasymachus lets him have this argument. And it's kind of odd, actually. He kind of says, well, I'm kind of tired of arguing, and this has gone on so long. And so Socrates scores this last point. But then, and this is important going into book two, which we'll cover tomorrow, then in the last couple of pages, Socrates wants to say, but really, Thrasymachus, you're right about a few things here. And in particular, you're right to raise the question of why one ought to be just. It's not just a question of what justice is, which to be clear, we haven't figured out yet, but it's also what kind of thing is justice? Why would one ought to be just? So as we see in the second to last page here, it's page 33, he says, come, let's consider this now. Is there some work of a soul that you couldn't ever accomplish with any other thing that is, for example, managing, ruling, and deliberating and all such things? Could we justly attribute them to anything other than a soul and assert that they are peculiar to it, to nothing else? And further, what about living? Shall we not say that it is the work of the soul? Right. So the soul, he says, the soul is for figuring out how to live. And the best soul is that soul which lives well. And so what we want to know is justice part of that living well? Thrasymachus would suggest that it isn't. If the unjust man always comes out on top, if injustice always pays, then it would seem that the soul would be interested in injustice, that the virtue of the soul would be in doing unjust things because that's what helps one get ahead. But Socrates he wants to argue the opposite. Didn't we agree that justice is virtue of soul and injustice vice? We did so agree. Then the just soul and the just man will have a good life, and the unjust man a bad one. It looks like it according to your argument. And the man who lives well is blessed and happy, and the man who does not is the opposite, of course. Then the just man is happy, and the unjust man is wretched. So that's where we leave off book one. So we've had these three definitions of justice given to us by Kepler, Polemarchus, and Thrasymachus. We've seen refutations of these three theories of justice. And then at the very end, we see a second question emerge. The first question is what justice is. And the second question is why one ought to be just. Why is justice good? And it's that second question that we will turn our attention to tomorrow. All right, so that is it for now. That's it for book one. Please take a look at your question sets, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.